name is Siplon. I'm the Executive Director of the Center of Innovation for Logistics, and I'll tell you what that means in a second. The presentation I brought to you, and some of you have seen some of these slides before, it's called The Changing Ecosystem. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Panama Canal. I could do this for a couple hours, and I promise you I won't. So what I'd like to do is just sort of fast forward through some things that are changing. There's a lot changing in the ecosystem of logistics, and I'll define that for you a little bit. But would love to kind of leave it open and get some questions from you all and get some conversation on topics that you're most interested in. So I'll jump through some different details and give you an update on what's sort of happening in our ecosystem around freight, and then hopefully leave some time for questions at the end. Just for a note or two on what we do for the center, I run, again, the Innovation Center, which is a industry-focused component of the state's economic development efforts, specifically the Department of Economic Development. I use this slide because this is from the state of South Carolina's competitiveness initiative, and I always thought it was nice to use one of our neighbors' competing slides. This is actually from their initiative. They did a presentation, and we're talking about the things that Georgia's doing to help compete for freight. How do we attract business? And we're using us as an example, and very flatteringly, that's why I like to use the slide, things that we're doing in Georgia to attract new business. But so basically what we focus on is helping companies that are either involved in logistics or are impacted by logistics or use logistics, help them grow and compete. Keith was talking about attracting new businesses, and that's what we do as a state as best we can. We know that regardless of the type of company that's looking to do business, whether they're a food processor, whether they're a Home Depot, whether they're a forestry or a poultry producer, they have logistics issues. And we know that if they're looking to do business somewhere or they're looking to relocate their business, we see, and I sit across the table from them very often, they have their VP of supply chain, they have their VP of logistics in the room to help them make that decision on where they want to do business. So logistics is economic development, and it's a backbone for a lot of things. And it goes from railroads, and Brad and I were talking about that just a few minutes ago, to roads, to rails, to our seaports, to our airports. And I'll touch on a little bit of that for you this morning. I thought this was interesting, and I'm not going to read this all to you, but I gave a presentation up in Maryland, and they were asking me about Atlanta and the sort of the terminus definition. And if you've heard this story before, just bear with me. But I thought it was interesting that, you know, logistics is sort of in the DNA of Georgia. And there's probably stories like this for Albany and for many other places around the state. But in Atlanta, now back in 1836, the Georgia General Assembly voted to create the Western Atlantic Railroad in order to connect the port of Savannah with the Midwest. The initial route was going to be between Chattanooga and a place that they called just Terminus, which was the original name of Atlanta, and located between the Chattahoochee River, and was eventually going to connect Augusta with Macon and travel on to the Midwest as well. That point where it's called Terminus is now, they drove a milepost there, and it's now called 5 Points, if you're familiar with the Atlanta area. They then changed, at sort of a dark time, I think, in the naming of Atlanta, went from Terminus, which has some interesting history, to Thrasherville, and then to Marthasville, and then on to, the chief engineer said, you know, well, we're really connecting Atlantic to Pacific, or what about the name Atlantica Pacifica, which isn't really roll off your tongue. So they shortened that to Atlanta, and then the residents approved back in 1847 to title and name the city of Atlanta what it is today. So I just thought it was interesting that, you know, logistics goes all the way back to our roots. And what we are as a state, and that holds true for some of our unfair advantages that I'll talk about when it comes to infrastructure. A quick, just funny survey, and you can read ahead. Just by a show of hands, who here is directly involved in logistics? And there's a few. So for those of you that didn't raise your hand, who here has ever bought anything, specifically at a store? Yeah, one of us probably has somewhere. And then if you've ever bought anything, who here has sat in traffic and said, man, I am tired of this logistics, I am tired of this freight. I could buy everything online. We don't need to really focus on logistics anymore. I could just go on the internet and buy everything I need. Well, there's a lot of logistics behind that too. Or, you know, the grocery store always has the food I need. We don't really need to focus on logistics and freight movement because the grocery store is always fully stocked. They always have the milk I need. They always have the food that I want to go buy. Well, that's logistics that makes all that happen. So if I just define logistics for you a little bit, and you can read some of these definitions. My military background likes to point to Sun Tzu, who, if you've read it, wrote The Art of War, who says the line between disorder and order lies in logistics. And hopefully if you're one of those few that raise their hand the first time, you get more of the latter than the former in that definition. And that's some of the stuff that we help companies with in my day job. You can read the more verbose definition from the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals. But the one I use the most often is really logistics is really connecting and moving stuff from point A to point B. And that stuff can be people, and we talk about transit. It could be people moving very fast, and we talk about high-speed rail, or people moving very slowly, and we talk about the area of Atlanta. But the kicker is there's a lot of dots that we need to connect to move stuff from point A to point B. And if we're going to do it efficiently and securely from our previous presentation, and most importantly, cost effectively, there's a lot of dots that we need to understand and appreciate for what logistics really entails. And I wanted to just point a few of those out to you. Another quick quiz, if you are one of those first few people that raise your hands, another word that's used often is supply chain, analogous to logistics, and that's a whole nother presentation. But what does a supply chain look like? It can be fancy and very decorative and more of top dressing. Or it could be a very intricate part of your operations, very mechanical, sort of the nuts and bolts behind what you do as a business. Or it could just be a huge pain in your ankle, apparently. And hopefully it's not the C. If it's number C or letter C there, we need to talk afterwards, because I've seen that face on a variety of people that do logistics business in Georgia, and we try to help them too. But or if you Google the internet and look for logistics as a definition, you just click on the image tab in Google, this is some of the stuff that'll pop up. Lots of different ways to look and what a supply chain is. And it's different between every company you look at and how those products move, and I've got a couple more pictures of this to show you. But supply chains are complex, right? And this isn't meant to hurt your eyes, and I've got a few of these slides that will probably do that if you look too closely at them. But if you look at just that bottom layer, and this is actually a very simplified slide that shows just some of the things that are involved in these layers of a supply chain, or some of the things that are involved in logistics. If we look at sort of the bottom layer and you look at some of those little squares or diamonds if you're tilting your head, we see ports, we see ocean carriers, we see railroads, we see trucks. Makes a lot of sense. That's what most of us think about when we think about logistics and supply chain. If you take it up a notch, really it's a lot more than that. It's about the financial transactions, it's about the movement of information, it's about international trade, and that transactional layer that arguably is sometimes even more important than the cargo itself and more valuable to the shippers and the receivers than the cargo itself. And then we all need some good oversight. We heard a little bit about some of the federal and state stuff that's going on the security side. And like for example, the Department of Homeland Security isn't listed up there at all on one of those diamonds on the top layer. So again, a very simplified slide just to give you an example that supply chains are very complex. And even more interestingly than them being complex, they're all very unique, right? This would change cargo theft significantly, wouldn't it? If we still hauled cargo. Well, that's not how we haul poultry anymore in Georgia. Again, Keith would be out of a job if it was. But you know, for a guy who runs an innovation center, I like this slide because really it's about being creative, right? This is an example. These are a few examples, and I've got many of these slides of people doing the best with what they have. And without getting too parochial here, you know, with our economy the way it is and our DOT budget, which has about $10 left in it for making improvements, we all have to be very creative on where we spend those dollars to make improvements and do the best with what we have. So I'm not endorsing us moving poultry like that or moving recyclables by bicycles anymore, but sometimes we need to be creative and think innovatively, think outside the box to get something done. And I'll just kind of leave you with that. But at the end of the day, though, it's about the bottom line is the dollar, right? It's about sales and revenue. The people that raise your hand at first, you didn't do it. You're not involved in logistics because you love it so much and it's just so fun. You do it for free. You do it to make money, right? We all do. And if we look at the total, sort of the bottom line, logistics plays a very conservative number of 10%. If we get into things like pharmaceuticals or even wood pellets that we ship over to Europe for biomass conversion and others, that bottom line revenue, sales and revenue we spend on logistics can get up to the 40 or 50% mark on the amount of money that you need to spend to move that product. A vast majority on the transportation side, and then a bulk of it on storing it and making sure it's secure as well. But a lot of that money goes to logistics, so it's a big part of all businesses. Again, whether you're a food producer or a poultry, it doesn't really matter. You're going to spend money on transportation and logistics. So what does that look like in Georgia? Who's spending money on logistics? Who's making money on logistics? This is part of the research that we do as a center for the state and for companies. We call it an ecosystem, and I'll use that word probably more than you'll like me to from here on out. We divide the logistics industry into two basic groups. Those that wake up every day to make $1 off providing that service. Trucking companies, railroads, software companies, and others makes quite a bit of sense. If we look at the number of companies, and I'll show you a picture of this in a minute, they employ about 142,000 people across the state. That is not an economic impact model. It's no sort of formula. It's a totally Excel column type of problem. About 142,000 people are involved in that provider side. If we add to that those folks, their customers that are using logistics services, there's about 30,000 companies in Georgia that use logistics or significantly dependent on logistics. And they add about another 800,000 employees. So without hurting your head a little bit, about 1 million employees in Georgia are directly involved in logistics, either using it or providing it every day. So what does that look like? And again, not meant to hurt your eyes, but if you sort of squint and tilt your head a little bit, you can see some clusters. Obviously Atlanta, just with the population base that they are, has a lot of providers and users of logistics services. You can see clusters throughout the state in basically all places. If you look at some from an economic development point of view, an interesting question is, why are there not more dots in other places? And you can pick out your county that you like and look, is it an infrastructure, I heard somebody say? Is it an infrastructure issue? If we put another short line, if we put another spur, would we be able to attract more customers? Is it a policy issue? Is it an incentive issue? Is it what are the issues that are keeping more dots from showing up in those necks of the woods that there's not as many? What kind of things can we do to help grow that business? And from an economic development point of view, and a guy that's just focused on logistics, that's what we like to explore and talk about with companies and talk about with economic developers. Some of you are here in the room that we've talked and had the same conversation about before. The other thing that's interesting about this, and you can't really see it from the colors, is the color of the dots, the blue dots specifically. And no newsflash, but small businesses, the backbone for really all industries, and that's certainly true in logistics as well. For example, on the trucking industry side, just one slice, a big slice, but a slice of the logistics ecosystem. About 81% of the trucking industries have less than 5 employees. I thought it was interesting, it matched up with some of the numbers that you were talking about how many trucks they have. It's almost the same statistic. And that's true in Georgia as well. So why does that matter? Well, when we have that conversation on how they're going to reduce that amount of money they spend on logistics or how they're going to compete and grow, they have smaller capital. Large, huge freight firms and large trucking companies, the Home Depots of the world, have a different sort of problem set they need to address. So working on those small businesses, since they are such a large slice of the industry, what are their problems? How can we help them grow and compete? And those are conversations that we have every day. Another question that I get asked pretty often is, okay, people look at me, especially flight attendants it seems, look at me very strange when they see the Georgia peach. First of all, I have to explain to them it's not Tropicana, and somebody asked me if I worked for Tropicana before, and I haven't told the governor yet that, but they say, so what's innovative in logistics? Okay, well, where do you start, right? I mean, how do you slice that up? And I don't have this conversation often on airplanes, but I've tried to think about, how do you explain that? What is logistics and what's innovative, what's going on, what's changing in that ecosystem of logistics? And I came up with these 3 V's, and this holds true for regardless of what you do in the industry or how you're involved. If you're involved in logistics, the more stuff you move, the more successful and profitable you'll be. For the most part, right? You move more boxes, you make more money. But that's not good enough, right? So if you're moving volume, which is that first V, you got to do it faster, better, cheaper, and securely as well. I'll add that in from our previous presentation. But you've got to do it with great supply chain velocity, and there's a plethora and a whole bunch of different technologies and things that are involved in helping you move that freight securely and at a quick pace throughout the supply chain. And if you're doing the first of those two, if you've got some good velocity, you've got some good volume, you've got some good basic customers, you're moving it faster, better, cheaper than your competitors, you've got to have supply chain visibility. Again, fits into the security piece as well. Visibility of the box itself, of the cargo, but also visibility into your process to make sure you can analyze and compete and change the way you do things to keep up with your customers, or you won't have those customers for very long. So those 3 V's of logistics, again, very, very simplified, but I thought was a a good way to sort of talk about at a high level, and you could probably go through your own mind on some of those parts of your business that fit into those 3 V's, and which ones you're strong in and which ones you're not so much. So a little bit on what's changing. A lot of stuff's changing. As a matter of fact, I was up in Atlanta yesterday talking about our statewide freight plan that we're just finishing up. I don't have a lot of statistics on that to share with you today, but I'd love to come back and talk to you in the future about what the state's doing to come up with their business plan for freight and logistics infrastructure. And there was a little write-up in the newspaper about that in the AJC today as well. But what's changing is, and this somebody mentioned before about all the freight that's coming our way. This is a national number. By the year 2050, roughly we're going to add about 100 million people to the U.S. population. You can round that up or down, whatever your favorite statistician gives you. But on average, we consume and contribute into the freight network, all of us, about 40 tons per person per year. So pretty simple math problem. We're going to be adding, by the year 2050, about 4 billion tons on top of what we already move now. And I'll get into the Georgia side in a second. 4 billion more tons of cargo that's going to be added into the network. How do we do that? We're not going to be able to just build more roads to be able to handle all this new influx of freight. It's going to require railroads. It's going to require new analysis of how we move stuff over the ocean, new analysis of how we move stuff on air freight. And the states and the communities and the neighborhoods that are thinking creatively are going to be the ones that are going to be able to capture more business and be able to attract more of that 4 billion tons of cargo. And along with that, all the jobs and economic impact that it creates for your communities. Going back to that slide on the every supply chain is unique point of view, and these are 3 things that we use in our statewide freight plan. If we're going to add this volume, we've got to add more capacity. There's no silver bullet, right? We know we're going to need better, more efficient roads. We're going to need more roads. We're going to need better short line infrastructure. We're going to need new Class 1 infrastructure, the Crescent Corridor, and some other major infrastructure projects that the railroads are working on. We're going to need more capacity. But just building more, kind of like the volume V, is not good enough. We got to make sure that that capacity has the right capabilities to handle these unique products today and the unique products that are going to be flowing through our supply chains here in Georgia tomorrow. Wood pellets is a good example, and I can get into that a little bit later. So we got to make sure that our railroads have the right height and weights. We've got double tracks. We've got all these different capabilities that we're going to need to move products efficiently, securely. And if we don't, that product's going to go somewhere else. And that'll come into play when I talk about the Panama Canal. And then finally, does that capacity and that capability give you the right connectivity into our major freight hubs? The Port of Savannah. A lot of freight coming through there, going all over the United States, all over Georgia. Our world's busiest airport, I went through yesterday. Number 10 now, up from number 11 as far as air cargo volumes in the United States. A lot of cargo. Those are major freight hubs for our state. And there are others located around in South Georgia, Augusta, and a variety of other areas that are emerging freight hubs, and some that are more established around our state. How can we leverage those? How can we make sure we're taking advantage and providing the connectivity, the last mile connectivity, in some instances, into those freight hubs? So for Georgia, going into our slice currently, this is actually last year's number, and these numbers are hard to get your head around. And I'll show you a map that's equally as hard to comprehend, but $1.5 trillion worth of value just on the trucking side flowing in, out, and through our state every year, right? Significant. I mean, $1 trillion, that's a big number, right? Or if we look at it from a tonnage point of view, and this is important when we look at our road infrastructure and our rail infrastructure, 570 million tons flowing in, out, and through our state every year. Or on the number of truck moves, 53 million truck moves, again, on our roads every day. And I can tell you that the railroad side, I don't have a slide like this for a railroad, but I do have a map. It's equally as significant. A smaller slice, about 80% of the cargo that flows through our state flows by truck, about 20% by rail, and that needs to change a little bit as well if we're going to keep up with that 4 billion tons that I mentioned before. So what does that look like? And this is data that we have, and we break this down by county, and I could do this by zip code. So if you're interested in getting something for your community, we're actually working on that for a variety of communities around Georgia, but it's flowing everywhere, right? And you can see the major arteries, probably no huge surprise there. You can see the numbers over to the side that represent some of that. This is an aggregate. This is an added together of all the to, from, through, inside. It's all summed together in one map, although we break that down as well. What might be hard to see is the smaller orange lines, which are still between 0 and 5 million tons, which is a significant amount of volume, really permeating every part of the state of Georgia just on truck. But we can do better, right? I mean, if one of the big things on the trucking side, and our previous presenter, Keith, and them talked about empty trailers. The nature of the business is that the most expensive thing in the industry to move is air, not buy air, but to move empty trailers. Empty backhauls are a major problem. And even though we're moving stuff all over the state of Georgia, and we've got a great export community and a lot of freight flowing that way, in 2007, we had about 12 million empty movements in our infrastructure on the roads. In 2007. And now a lot of that, it does work. If you look, you could see, this stays up, you could see some of these pockets down in Savannah and in the Atlanta area, and that's just sort of the nature of the business. Home Depot doesn't export. They got a huge facility in Savannah. They're going to have a lot of empty movements going back to the port to drop those containers. That happens, and that's okay. It's only about a 2-mile haul. But what about some of these spans going from Macon to Atlanta? How can we use that and reduce those? If you, and I'm not talking about eliminating them, you reduce it by 1%, that's dollars into the pockets of trucking companies, and maybe can go more onto the railroad side to help us be more efficient on how we move freight. I don't have all the answers, but we know this is an opportunity area as we move forward. If we switch for a second and look at, this is actually current, in 2011 Georgia rail flow, significant volumes moving as well, about 20% right now of our trucking totals. I should have a slide on here that's got the numbers off the top of my head. I don't remember them, but significant volumes, again, moving all over the state of Georgia, even by rail too, right? A lot of folks think rail is more of just an Atlanta thing, or it's a stream just up the middle of the state. But I know you're going to hear from Jonathan later about Cordeal and all the great stuff they're doing to move cargo east-west to the Port of Savannah as well. A great example of how we can be creative and innovative on putting new infrastructure and utilizing it better here in our state. And I like this slide because it talks about how railroads have apparently been doing a lot for very little for many years. And this is average revenue per ton mile for the railroad rate side compared to how things have changed from 1981 to 2009. Railroad rates have stayed pretty low. They have not spiked like the price of bread, inflation, and all that stuff. So railroads have still been able to contribute and move freight. I had another slide that I took out, move a quite significant share of the freight at a very competitive price point, depending on where it was going and how it was being moved, and depending on the product. But we know that railroads are going to be a part of that answer going forward. Comparatively, if we look at fuel prices, we've been sort of lulled into accepting, I know, and I'm sure we all do it when we drive past the gas station, wow, $3.15, $3.22, what a bargain, I better stop and fuel up. Well, that's crazy, But I mean, no economist that I've ever talked to is expecting that to drop down to all the way back to below $3 levels in 2010, right, when things have spiked up quite considerably. So fuel prices on the trucking side is a significant factor as we look at how we move freight, and it dictates which modes we use and how we use rail and so on. So it's another thing that's changing, and unfortunately, this is probably one of those areas that's probably not going to change a whole lot as far as prices go for diesel fuel. If you haven't heard, and I know Robert Morris is I think still going to give you a presentation a little bit later, and I'm hopefully not stealing too much of his thunder here, so I only have 1 or 2 slides. But what's changing is we're moving a lot more freight, and have been moving more freight every year through the Port of Savannah, both in Savannah and also down in Brunswick now, every year. And for example, so we're up almost to about 3 million tons, which keeps us as the 4th largest container volume port in the country, and Robert will rattle through all those highlight reels. But what I thought was interesting, what's changing going back, a lot of folks say, Charleston I get asked about quite a bit, and there's a whole host of reasons why Savannah has been the fastest growing port in the country for 10 years or so now. And I won't get into all those details because Robert will touch on those as well. But this is a significant indicator of when I talk about Panama Canal, the amount of freight flow, if this holds true and we continue this competitive position, the amount of freight that's going to come into our state as opposed to some of our neighboring states, and most importantly, the flow that's coming from the West Coast that wants to come east. And I'll hit on that more specifically. Another new statistic, and I know Robert, I'm stealing this from him, but we are now the #2 export port by tonnage in the nation, behind only Los Angeles. And that's significant. Don't get confused with being the #2 port in the nation, because that word export tonnage is very important. But being the #2 export port in the country is a significant driver for jobs in our community, and a whole host of other things that are important to our non-logistics companies. What's growing? Some other things that are changing, e-commerce fulfillment. We're working multiple projects as a state. We have a lot of stuff that's going on the agriboxing side, and what that means is taking agriculture products and putting it in containers, just because it's easier to handle and move and store. Putting grains and pellets into containers because it's easier to control the temperature and the humidity of some of those products as well. Perishables, everybody's going to get sick and they've got to eat. So we see the perishables industry, and specifically cold chain and cold storage facilities, being a huge opportunity area, specifically for Georgia, because of the amount of poultry we have. We've done some pretty good work on identifying where those cold storage facilities are, and frankly where there's not as many as there needs to be. The biomass pellets I mentioned before is a huge industry. The plant in Waycross, creating about 750,000 tons per year, moving it out of the port of Savannah, and that terminal, that private terminal, a non-GPA facility, that private terminal in Savannah is the largest wood export terminal in the world. Export terminal. Now, of course, that's all going over to Europe where they're consuming it. Hopefully someday that will shift and we'll have more domestic consumption for wood pellets and alternative energy as well. But we've got some significant things we can point to. So exports and biomass pellets are two of the things that are going to help us continue to grow and compete going forward. And there's a whole bunch of others. Those are just a few that I pulled out. Things that are growing in the logistics markets as well. So the one multiple game changers, I've touched on a few of those. The one game changer I wanted to talk about was the Panama Canal, because it's about 100 years overdue. If you look at going all the way back, just a really 2-second history lesson here, go back to 1855, where they constructed the Panamanian Railroad to move freight across that country and get it to the other side, the other coast, was a game changer for how we moved freight. They weren't done there. In 1914, I jumped over a few years and quite a bit of work, but in 1914 they opened the Panama Canal. The precursor to that, again, was the railroad. They opened the Panama Canal, and just to give you a perspective of the design specifications, not to get too technical, that were used for the Panama Canal, does anybody know how old the container is? The innovation of a steel box? How many years old? Sounds like we've been putting stuff in steel boxes forever, right? About 50 years, 55 years now. So way after the Panama Canal was finished and completed. So container ships weren't even a thought when they finished the Panama Canal. There were no container ships going through the Panama Canal because they didn't exist. Things have changed. And since 1914 to 2014, they have made no improvements other than small maintenance things. They've made no improvements to that Panama Canal. During that period of time, about 1 million transits went through the Panama Canal at a price of about $200,000 for fees per vessel. And you pay more to get to the front of the line, and it gets complicated. Or about 8 billion linear tons of cargo just during that 1915 to 2010 time period. And these are all slides courtesy of the Panama Canal Authority. But it was a game changer and continues to be a game changer for world trade, even with no improvements made to their infrastructure, which I think is phenomenal. For example, and this is sort of a busy slide, but the one to look at is the red line is the amount of transits, right? So you can see the number of transits sort of capped out, but the number of tons, which is the yellow line, continues to grow. And that's represented by that top picture there. The boats are getting bigger and bigger, and based on those design parameters they used for Panama Canal, they were very narrow, and they had to make them taller. which doesn't make them the most optimal design for a ship, for those of you who've ever sailed. So that's why container ships are so tall and skinny, because they got to fit through the Panama Canal. And they aptly named them Panamax and post-Panamax style vessels, whether they could fit through the Panama Canal or not. So the demand was there. The ships have gotten bigger. The transits have sort of leveled out after about 1980 or so. So for their 100th birthday, they just completed actually another big turning point in their construction. They're adding a third set of locks and basically removing the speed bump that they had in place since 1914. And there's a lot of details on this slide, but basically the size of the vessel is about 4,400 containers. It's not exactly right, but I'll just call them containers that can fit on a vessel that comes through the Panama Canal, and they come to the port of Savannah many, many times a week. When they add these deeper locks and wider locks, we'll be able to get about triple the size of the vessel that'll fit through that Panama Canal. And I'll talk to that. The number I'm going to use is, this is sort of the maximum size. This size vessel will never come to the East Coast. And I'll explain that in detail later if you want me to. The number to remember is 8,000 containers. That's sort of the workhorse that'll be visiting the East Coast, visiting Savannah, visiting New York and Virginia as well. Those 8,000 TEU vessels can currently come to the port of Savannah, but can only do it within a limited window. And I'll get into that if you need me to. But, so they're changing and growing, and those vessels are getting larger and larger. What I wanted to point out, though, with again, no improvements, and I'll explain this slide to you, but with no improvements to the infrastructure, the Panama Canal, which is the red slide, this is cargo that came into the West Coast from Asia and wanted to get to the East Coast. And what this slide shows is how it got there from the West Coast to the East Coast. So if we look back in 1999, about 86% of the cargo went intermodal, got on a train or a truck, predominantly a train, on the West Coast and was railed over to the East Coast. About 11% of it came through the Panama Canal. And again, with no changes in their infrastructure, you can see how that Panama Canal has dominated and grown its market share between 1999 and 2007. Imagine what's going to happen when they actually open those floodgates, literally, and allow these bigger vessels to come through. And comparatively, looking at Suez Canal, which really, if anything, has lost market share and really has done nothing to try to capture more volume coming through it. The reason why it's important, and we could talk about more volume, and I've mentioned that a few times, but the reason why companies like Home Depot and the importers and even the exporters care is because it's going to be cheaper. And that's not just important to the Home Depot, but Home Depot sells stuff to people like us. So we care because those products are going to have a reduced logistics cost. If you remember going back to one of those first slides, it's going to be more cost effective, it's going to be more efficient for that cargo to come to the East Coast, because that's where it wants to go. And those all-water routes make it more cost competitive. If we look at this slide, if we look at those 4,000 TEU vessels that currently can serve, as the workhorse now, currently serve the East Coast, from a cost perspective, only about 46% of the United States, if you're going to make a choice, do I move it to the West Coast or I bring it in all water to the East Coast, only about 46% of the United States is cost competitive at a 4,000 TEU vessel. When we increase the Panama Canal, the size of the Panama Canal, and allow those 8,000 TEU ships to come through, for the first time in the history of the United States, and that sounds bold, but it's true, the East Coast is more competitive than the West Coast. So you can look, going from 46% to 63%, we are now more competitive bringing all water through the East Coast to ports like Savannah that will be ready to handle these larger ships shortly after the canal's completed, and bringing all water to the East Coast to serve populations like Atlanta, to serve populations like California. About 6% of our cargo goes back out to California, all water through Panama Canal. That number will continue to grow. So the cost competitiveness of going from the 4,000 TEU vessels to an 8,000 TEU vessel is probably the biggest driver. And that's what companies like Home Depot are looking at when they make their decisions on where to build a distribution center, where to build new infrastructure, how they're going to move, and where they're going to move their freight through. From a rail perspective, why that's important to us, I mean, if you go back to this slide, you can say, well, aren't we eliminating some of the drivers? We're going to use less rail, we're going to use less trucks, it's just going to come into the port. Well, why that's important to us, and this is going to hurt your eyes, but the red and the black and the blue lines are CSX and Norfolk Southern. This doesn't show all the short lines, but the short lines are what link all those together. And I know Jonathan will talk about that, but on the left side, as you're sitting, these green and yellow lines are the ones that are going to have to really be scratching their head and figuring out how they compete with that slide. Because now we're sort of putting this on its head, right? We're telling the intermodal folks, hey, we're going to reduce the price to bring this stuff all water through the Panama Canal. What are you going to do to be able to compete? That's going to reduce costs even on the railroad side for these long haul railroads like Canadian National and Union Pacific that are doing long hauls from the West Coast. It'll be significantly positive for CSX and Norfolk Southern and our short line partners, because you can tell that they pretty much dominate that 63% area, right? So we're creating a huge market driver for those short lines and those class ones that are to the right of that red line that I drew in there. So things are changing. We got a lot more volume coming our way. There's no silver bullet on how we're going to handle that. I mentioned that the state is working, and I'm working with the private industry sector to create a business plan for how we're going to handle that, where we're going to make strategic investments, and I can go into some of those details in a bit if you'd like, but it's about as fast as I can go through a pretty complicated set of statistics and some data. Thank you.